Magda Goebbels, the mother who poisoned her own children. She didn't wear a uniform. She didn't pull a trigger. But on the final day of Hitler's regime, Magda Goebbels committed one of the most haunting crimes of the entire war. Berlin, April 30, 1945. Outside, the ground shook. Soviet tanks rolled over shattered streets. Inside the Führer bunker, deep beneath the smoldering Reich chancellery, the most loyal figures of the Nazi regime awaited the end. Magda Goebbels, the glamorous wife of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, stood in the dim corridor in full control of her decision. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She had made up her mind. Without Hitler, she told those around her, we cannot live. And she meant it. But it wouldn't be just her and Joseph who would die. Magda had brought her 6 children into the bunker, and she had no intention of letting them survive. The bunker, a cathedral of death. Magda was often called the First Lady of the Third Reich. Her children, 5 daughters and 1 son, aged 4 to 12, were admired, photographed, paraded as the image of the perfect Nazi family. In those last days, the bunker echoed with whispered prayers and gasps of despair. The walls were slick with sweat. Air grew thick with smoke and fear. And Magda floated through it like a ghost already dead. On April 30th, Hitler and Eva Braun died by suicide in the adjacent room. Their bodies were burned in the garden above. Magda wept, not for Hitler's death, but because his death made hers necessary. A mother's final gift. That night, she dressed her children in white nightgowns. She brushed their hair. She kissed each one on the forehead. Then, one by one, she gave them morphine to knock them unconscious. And then, cyanide. Witnesses said she killed them calmly, methodically, with help from an SS doctor. Some say she wept. Others say she was serene. She believed she was sparing them from a world without National Socialism, one historian writes. But it was not mercy. It was madness. Why didn't she let them live? To understand Magda's choice, you must understand faith corrupted. She idolized Hitler, not like a political leader, but like a savior. He was, in her eyes, the man who restored Germany's pride, who guided them like Moses from shame to strength. Without him, the world was chaos, and she refused to let her children live in that chaos. If he's gone, she said, there's no point. We're all dead anyway. Even Joseph Goebbels, the master manipulator, reportedly hesitated. But Magda pushed forward. In her twisted view, this was mercy. The next morning, silence. When the SS guards finally opened the children's bedroom, they found them laid side by side, like dolls in a display. Their faces, peaceful. But what happened next was even more chilling. Magda and Joseph stepped outside the bunker entrance. And there, in the rubble of a collapsing empire, they took cyanide. Joseph added a final bullet to his own head. Their bodies were partially burned, not fully destroyed, a grotesque echo of the Hitler-Braun suicide. The world reacts. When the Soviets stormed the bunker and found the bodies, even hardened soldiers were shaken. This, one Russian said, is what evil looks like in its final form, not a monster, but a mother who poisons her own children. Photos of the dead children spread across the world. And while Hitler's death was met with celebration, Magda's act brought only horror. Not because she was innocent, but because she proved that blind belief, when wrapped in motherly love, can become the most terrifying thing of all. Legacy. Some today ask, was Magda a victim, a brainwashed woman, or a cold-blooded killer? The answer may be this. She was both. A woman who loved her image more than truth. A mother who mistook ideology for identity. And a symbol of how far the human mind can fall when it worships power over life itself. Eva Braun, from lover to suicide bride. She waited in the shadows for over a decade. And just 40 hours before her death, Adolf Hitler finally made her his wife. Eva Braun was not a soldier. She never held political office. She wasn't seen at rallies, speeches, or war briefings. But she was always there, just out of the camera frame. The hidden mistress. The smiling blonde in home movies. The woman who devoted her life to a man who never truly saw her. And when Berlin fell and the Allies closed in, Eva Braun didn't run like so many others. She ran to him. A life spent waiting. Eva met Hitler when she was just 17, a shop assistant for his personal photographer. Charming, naive, obsessed with movies and fashion, she quickly fell under his spell. But Hitler kept her in the background, denied her publicly, even forbade her from appearing in photographs with him. She tried to end her life twice. Once with a pistol. Once with sleeping pills. But Hitler always brought her back, with gifts, promises, and a life of luxury behind closed doors. She was a possession, one Nazi insider later wrote. Cherished. Hidden. Controlled. The bunker wedding. By April 1945, the Third Reich was burning. Soviet artillery rattled the walls of the Führer bunker. Everyone knew it was over. But Eva stayed. And Hitler, for the first and only time, did something he'd never done. He married her. It was April 29th. The ceremony was short. Witnesses said Hitler looked pale, detached. Eva beamed. "I've finally become Frau Hitler," she whispered. "I don't care what happens now." She got what she wanted, the title. Even if it would only last 40 hours. The suicide pact. They ate breakfast together. They signed their wills. And then, calmly, they prepared to die. On April 30th, just after 3:30 p.m., Hitler took cyanide and a gun to his head. Eva only took the poison. She sat beside him on the couch, closed her eyes, and faded out of history. What the Soviets found. When Soviet troops finally entered the bunker, they found the charred remains. 2 bodies, side by side. Eva's dress was still partially visible beneath the ashes. Hitler's skull had been shattered by the bullet. But even in death, she was known simply as his shadow. There were no public trials for Eva Braun. No interrogations. No last statements. Her crime was silence. Her sentence was obliteration. Was she guilty? Some argue Eva Braun was just a naive girl caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But others, especially historians who've studied her diaries and letters, say she knew. She chose to stay. She chose to die with him. She never once denounced the crimes, not even in her private writings. She wasn't dragged into the darkness, a Holocaust survivor once said. She walked into it, smiling. Her last legacy. Eva Braun's name is barely mentioned in history textbooks. No statues, no memorials, no gravesite. Just a name, whispered at the end of Hitler's story. And maybe that's her true punishment. To be forever remembered not as a woman, but as a shadow behind a monster. Gerda Bormann, the invisible loyalist. She wasn't in the headlines. She wasn't on trial. But her loyalty to Hitler's regime lasted until her very last breath. Most people know Martin Bormann, Hitler's elusive secretary, the man who whispered into the Führer's ear during the final years of the war. But far fewer remember Gerda Bormann, the woman who stood silently beside him, raising their children and defending the Reich from behind heavy wooden doors. She was never filmed shouting in rallies. She didn't wear medals. But what made Gerda truly terrifying was that she believed it all. To her, Nazism wasn't just politics. It was righteousness, the hidden power behind the throne. Gerda was born into a conservative German family. She married Martin Bormann in 1929, before he rose through the Nazi ranks. As he became more powerful, she became more radical. She gave birth to 10 children, most of them during the war. And she fully supported the Nazi ideology of large, racially pure families. She was the model Nazi mother, one historian said. And she didn't question a single word of the regime. A fanatic until the end. Unlike some wives who distanced themselves after the war, Gerda doubled down. She wrote letters defending Hitler's vision. She scorned the Allies. She refused to believe the stories of mass extermination. Even as the Reich crumbled, Gerda stayed in the shadows, trusting her husband and the ideology they raised their children in. "Germany is still right," she reportedly told a priest in her final days. "They just don't understand yet." The collapse. As Berlin fell and Martin Bormann disappeared, Gerda was left alone, sick and stranded in southern Germany. She never saw her husband again. Rumors swirled that he had escaped, that he had been captured, even that he was still advising Nazis from the shadows. But Gerda, she knew nothing. No power. No protection. No future. Her final days. By 1946, Gerda was gravely ill, suffering from cancer. She lived under a false name, still raising the younger children, still refusing to repent. She died that year at just 36 years old. No ceremony. No confession. No reckoning. Just quiet bitterness, and a heart that never stopped believing in a world built on delusion. Her children's fate. Some of the Bormann children were adopted by Catholic families. Others were raised in shame, trying to erase the memory of who their father was. But Gerda's influence never left them. "We were taught to believe we were better than others," one son later said. "It took years to understand how poisoned we were." The unseen danger. Gerda Bormann didn't commit the crimes. She didn't pull the levers or issue the orders. But she cooked the meals, raised the next generation, and never once questioned the machine her husband built. She may not have been a monster, but she kept the monsters fed. Emmy Goring, the glamorous First Lady of the Reich. While bombs fell across Europe, she posed in silk gowns. While Jews were dragged from their homes, she hosted champagne galas. And when it all came crashing down, the fall from grace was devastating. If Magda Goebbels was the ideological mother of the Reich, Emmy Goring was its glittering queen. She was married to Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor, commander of the Luftwaffe, and one of the richest, most flamboyant leaders in the Nazi elite. Where others lived in bunkers and fear, Emmy lived in castles and excess. She wasn't just loyal to the regime, she was proud to be the face of its splendor. And in the end, that pride would cost her everything. The Nazi aristocracy. Before the war, Emmy was a famous stage actress, admired for her beauty and theatrical flair. When she married Hermann Göring, she stepped into a life of unimaginable luxury. They moved into Karenhall, a palatial estate filled with stolen art, rare furniture, and hand-fed deer roaming the gardens. Hitler adored her, nicknaming her the First Lady of the Third Reich. She basked in attention. She gave interviews about motherhood, morality, and beauty, all while ignoring the blood price her husband's Luftwaffe was inflicting across Europe. She played queen, one survivor later said, on a throne made of bones. The fall begins. By 1945, the castles were crumbling. The Allies bombed Göring's airfields into ash. His influence over Hitler had collapsed. And Emmy's lavish world started shrinking fast. Servants disappeared. Jewels were hidden. Fur coats were stuffed into suitcases. She thought they could escape, a witness later recalled. She still believed she could charm her way out. But Emmy was about to learn. Charm meant nothing when the world saw you as a symbol of evil. Capture and interrogation. As the Allies advanced, Emmy and her young daughter were captured. She was brought in for questioning, no longer in gowns, but in rags. Stripped of her power, Emmy lashed out. She begged for special treatment. She insisted she knew nothing of the Holocaust. She demanded her dignity back. The Allied officers gave her one reply. "You were his queen, and now you'll sleep in a cell." Life after glamour. After the war, Emmy was sentenced to a short prison term. But her true punishment was irrelevance. Her wealth was seized. Her titles revoked. Her husband, Hermann Göring, escaped the gallows by killing himself with cyanide just hours before his execution. Emmy spent the rest of her life in poverty. She worked odd jobs. She lived off charity. Her daughter grew up with a legacy too shameful to speak aloud. She never apologized, one interviewer said decades later. She missed the life, not the people it destroyed. A haunting reflection. In old age, Emmy rarely gave interviews. When she did, she smiled through yellowed teeth and spoke of the beauty of the past, the grand halls, the crystal chandeliers, the parties. But never of the prisoners. Never of the camps. Never of the firebombed cities or the millions murdered by the empire her husband helped build. She remembered the glitter, one journalist wrote. But the ash was always just behind her. Ilse Hess, the wife who followed her husband into madness. Her husband fled Nazi Germany on a secret solo flight to Scotland. She stayed behind and spent the rest of her life defending his actions, his beliefs, and his insanity. Ilse Hess is one of the least discussed women of the Nazi inner circle, but her story may be one of the most bizarre. She wasn't flamboyant like Emmy Goring. She wasn't infamous like Magda Goebbels. She was quiet, proper, devoted, and to the very end, she believed the world had misunderstood both her and her husband, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy Führer. But Rudolf didn't die in the bunker. He didn't face a firing squad. He flew himself, alone, on a suicidal mission to broker peace with Britain in 1941. The world thought he was insane. Ilse thought he was a hero. The day her world fell apart. When news broke that Rudolf Hess had parachuted into Scotland, Nazi Germany was in shock. Hitler was furious, declaring him mentally unstable and cutting all ties. Ilse. She was devastated and determined. My Rudolf, she said, did what no other man had the courage to do. He tried to save both nations. Her loyalty didn't waver. Not even when he was locked away in a British prison. Not even when Nuremberg put him on trial. Not even when he was sentenced to life in Spandau prison. A life in the shadows. Ilse spent the rest of her life trying to clear Rudolf's name. She published letters. She held interviews. She claimed her husband had been set up, or that he had been manipulated. Some of her theories bordered on conspiracy. Some were just desperate cries from a woman drowning in delusion. He was no traitor, she insisted. He was the only true patriot. When asked about the regime, the camps, or Hitler's crimes, Ilse deflected, denied, or ignored. For her, the story ended in 1941, and the rest was a smear campaign. A life of isolation. Ilse was never arrested or imprisoned after the war. But she wasn't exactly free. She was watched, shunned, mistrusted, viewed as the widow of madness. She raised her son alone, a child who would later try to distance himself from both parents. And she died in 1995, at 95 years old, still insisting Rudolf had been a misunderstood peacemaker. Legacy of denial. Even now, Ilse Hess's writings are studied for one chilling reason. She never questioned the regime. Not once. Not in public. Not in private. Not in the face of overwhelming evidence. Her loyalty was absolute. Final thought. Ilse Hess wasn't a criminal. She wasn't executed. She wasn't even tried. But her story proves that even outside the bunkers and battlefields, the poison of ideology can survive, in whispers, in words, and in memory. She didn't need to hold a gun, one historian said. She held the myth. And she never let it go. The Allied interrogations, women on trial. When the war ended, the world demanded justice. But what about the women behind the monsters? What they said in court, and what they didn't, is just as terrifying as the crimes themselves. May 1945. The Third Reich had collapsed. Berlin lay in ruins. Millions were dead. The world gasped at the true scale of the Holocaust. And now, the reckoning began. The Allied powers began rounding up Nazi officials, not just the generals and SS commanders, but the wives, the mistresses, the secretaries. Women who had lived in luxury during genocide. Women who said they knew nothing. But during the interrogations, behind locked doors, some of them broke. And what they revealed shocked even the interrogators. The interviews begin. British, American, and Soviet forces compiled lists of women closely tied to the regime. Among them, Emmy Goring, Ilse Hess, Gerda Bormann, posthumously examined, Magda Goebbels, already dead, SS wives stationed at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, secretaries who had typed death orders, women who had witnessed everything and said nothing. They were brought to holding camps and questioned for hours, days. Many lied. Many cried. Some cracked. I was just a housewife. That was the most common defense. I only took care of the home. I never went near the camps. I didn't know what my husband was doing. He never told me. But Allied psychologists began to notice patterns. Deliberate ignorance. Some women avoided all news, all talk of deportations, even as their towns emptied. Deflection. They blamed the men, while ignoring their own comforts. Coldness. Even when shown photos of the camps, some refused to acknowledge reality. They wore fur coats, one British officer noted. They drank French wine, and lived a few miles from hell. The secretaries who knew. Perhaps the most unsettling testimonies came from Hitler's inner circle of typists and aides, young women who took dictation, prepared speeches, and read every word of Nazi policy. Some were in their 20s. Many were beautiful, educated, and eerily calm. One, Traudl Junge, later confessed, "I typed the orders. I knew people were being deported, but I told myself it wasn't my concern. I didn't want to know." She later broke down in interviews, expressing shame. But many others never did. "They weren't monsters," said a U.S. interrogator. "They were ordinary, and that's what made it terrifying. Punishment, or lack of it. Most of the women were not charged. Unless they were caught directly participating in atrocities, they were often released. The logic was simple. They had no official power. They didn't sign the orders. They didn't fire the bullets. But the public didn't always agree. They sat at the tables of murderers," wrote a French journalist, "and they toasted to a dream built on blood." Some women faded into obscurity. Others, like Ilse Koch, the witch of Buchenwald, were arrested, tried, and sentenced to life for her role in one of the most brutal concentration camps. But for every woman punished, 10 more walked free. A chilling realization. What the Allies discovered during these interrogations wasn't just legal evidence. It was something far more disturbing. Evil can hide in comfort. Genocide can be fed by denial. And the women who smiled beside monsters weren't always innocent. The children left behind, the next generation of shame. They carried names they never asked for. And for the rest of their lives, they lived in the shadow of monsters. When the Nazi regime collapsed, thousands of children were left behind, the sons and daughters of the architects of terror. They weren't criminals. They weren't soldiers. But they bore the names of men and women whose decisions led to the death of millions. And for many of these children, that name became a lifelong curse. Growing up with a name like Bormann or Göring. Imagine being 8 years old and discovering that your father helped run concentration camps, or that your mother was a celebrated figure in Nazi propaganda. These weren't just rumors or family scandals. They were headlines, history books, war crime trials broadcast to the world. Children like Edda Göring, the only daughter of Hermann and Emmy Göring. Martin Bormann Jr., son of Hitler's powerful secretary. Gudrun Himmler, the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. They were rejected by neighbors, spat on in the street, and often grew up in foster care or under new identities to escape the sins of their parents. The battle between love and truth. Some of these children loved their parents deeply. They had memories of Christmas mornings, bedtime stories, laughter in the gardens of grand estates. But when they grew older and saw the truth, they were torn. Martin Bormann Jr. became a Catholic priest and dedicated his life to reconciliation, working with Holocaust survivors to confront his father's crimes. "I had to carry this name," he said, "so I tried to make it mean something different." Others, like Gudrun Himmler, went the opposite way. She remained loyal to her father's memory, even defending him publicly into the 1990s. "He was a good man," she once said. "He did what he believed was right." Her refusal to condemn him kept wounds open for decades. The weight of silence. For many of these children, no one wanted to hear their stories. Survivors were focused, rightfully, on healing, justice, and remembrance. And the idea of feeling sorry for the children of Nazis felt offensive to many. But inside, these children carried unspoken guilt, shame, and isolation. "I used to lie about who my parents were," one daughter of an SS officer said. "When the truth came out, I lost friends. Teachers avoided me. I stopped trusting anyone. Some tried to change the world." A few descendants of high-ranking Nazis became vocal anti-fascist activists. They wrote memoirs. They spoke in schools. They worked with museums and Holocaust education centers. Not to clear their names, but to own them. "We don't want forgiveness," one granddaughter of a Nazi officer said. "We want people to remember what happens when no one speaks up." But others didn't. Some Nazi descendants slipped into denial or nostalgia, romanticizing their family legacy or falling into extremist circles. In the post-war decades, neo-Nazi groups sometimes recruited these descendants as propaganda tools, using their names to push dangerous ideologies. It was a haunting reminder that history doesn't just end. It echoes. Final thought. The children of Nazi leaders didn't choose their parents, but they had to live with their legacies. Some broke the cycle. Others continued it. But all of them remind us that the past never fully dies. It passes through blood, through stories, and sometimes through silence. Legacy of the wives, forgotten, feared, or forgiven. Their husbands built the machinery of death. But what did these women build, and what did they leave behind? When we talk about Nazi Germany, we talk about men. Hitler, Himmler, Göring, Goebbels, the architects of horror, the engineers of genocide. But behind them stood women, not just passive wives, but participants, believers, enablers. They weren't the ones firing the guns or signing the orders, but they lit the candles at the dinner table while the world burned outside. And history has wrestled with one question ever since. What do we do with them? Forgotten by history. Some were quickly erased from memory. No documentaries. No biographies. No graves marked with their names. Emmy Göring died in 1973, in poverty, barely mentioned in the press. Gerda Bormann died in a hospital room, her children scattered and ashamed. Ilse Hess lived into her 90s, still insisting her husband was a martyr. They faded into obscurity. And many argue, that's exactly what they deserved. Feared for what they represent. Others became symbols of how fascism doesn't just thrive on brutality, but on glamour, comfort, and denial. Of how an ordinary woman, a wife, a mother, can be complicit in evil just by refusing to open her eyes. They remind us that ideology doesn't always come with fangs. Sometimes, it comes with lipstick, tea sets, and lullabies. Evil doesn't always scream, one Holocaust educator said. Sometimes, it smiles quietly from the balcony. Forgiven. That's more complicated. Some argue the women were victims of their husbands, brainwashed, trapped, too afraid to speak out. And in a few rare cases, maybe that was true. But the majority, they benefited. They believed. And when the war ended, they didn't apologize. They disappeared. Forgiveness requires acknowledgement. And most of these women never gave it. Why this story still matters. Today, it's easy to dismiss these names as relics of the past. But the truth is, their stories still echo in every conversation about denial, radicalization, and what we allow behind closed doors. They weren't monsters. They were mothers. They hosted tea parties. They wore pearls and praised Hitler's vision over piano music. And that's what makes them so terrifying. Final words. She wasn't holding the whip, one Auschwitz survivor said of a Nazi officer's wife. But she smiled at the man who did. And when I screamed, she shut the window. The Nazi wives were not just bystanders. They were mirrors, reflecting what happens when comfort becomes complicity. And if history teaches us anything, it's that evil doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, it wears a wedding ring.